Welcome to This Explainer. Look, if you are completely tired of feeling anxious every single time you have to ask for a raise, or, I don't know, if negotiating with your toddler currently feels like a tense hostage situation, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we are not going to look at a series of cheap tricks to manipulate people. Nobody wants that. Instead, we're initiating a complete paradigm shift, and this is entirely based on decades of behavioral economics research from heavy hitters like Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton. We're going to unpack the absolute fundamentals of negotiation so you can start creating way better outcomes in your life, literally starting today. But to start, we have to completely debunk a really common myth. What exactly comes to your mind when you hear the word negotiation? For a lot of folks, it's this intense debate where someone absolutely has to win and someone has to lose. Or maybe it's this really painful compromise, or even kind of a form of manipulation. But the truth is, negotiation is just an interaction where you want something and the other person has the power to give it to you. That's it. And you do this every single day. You negotiate deadlines with your boss, bedtime with your kids, and weekend plans with your partner. Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. 1. What negotiation actually is. 2. Your secret weapon, BATNA. 3. Interests versus positions. 4. Expanding the pie. And 5. Anchors and concessions. This structured approach is going to completely transform how you handle everything from everyday conflicts to major salary discussions. So, Section 1, what negotiation actually is. Before we can master the tactics, we really have to understand the environment we're operating in. True negotiation isn't just about making demands. It actually requires a state of independence. That means you need them, but just as importantly, they need you. If one party holds absolutely all the cards, that's not a negotiation, right? That's just a command. Negotiation only happens when both sides have some leverage and the ability to simply say no. The thing is, most people approach every single conflict like distributive bargaining. Think about buying a used car. There's one car and one price. Every dollar the seller gains is a dollar the buyer loses. It's a highly competitive zero-sum game where you're fighting over a fixed pie. But integrative negotiation is an entirely different beast. Imagine forming a business partnership. One of you has product skills, the other has sales skills. By cooperating, you create far more joint value together than either of you could alone. You aren't just dividing a fixed pie anymore, you're expanding it. And the very best negotiators out there know exactly when to collaborate and when to compete. Moving right along to Section 2, your secret weapon, BATNA. We are now getting to the absolute core source of power in any negotiation. This is a concept originally developed by researchers at Harvard. And once you grasp this, you'll honestly never walk into a negotiation feeling entirely powerless again. So, BATNA stands for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In plain terms, it's just your backup plan. What are you going to do if this current deal completely falls apart? Here is the major secret most people miss. The person with the most power in a room is actually not the person who is the loudest, or the most aggressive, or even the most experienced. The real power belongs to the person with the better backup plan, simply because they have the ultimate leverage, the ability to just walk away. Let's put some real numbers to this to anchor it. Imagine you're negotiating a salary for a new job. Let's say you already have another written offer in hand for $75,000. Well, that $75,000 is your BATNA. Because you have that solid backup, this number instantly becomes your reservation price. It's your absolute bottom line. You won't accept a single penny less than this because, well, you don't have to. And a massive rule of thumb here, you must never, ever reveal your reservation price to the other party. Because if they know your absolute bottom line, they're going to push you right to it. Now, what's really interesting about this next part is if $75,000 is your absolute minimum, $90,000 might be your aspiration point. This is your target. It's the goal you really hope to achieve. You might assume it's kind of safer to aim lower so you don't look crazy, but behavioral research consistently shows us that setting an ambitious yet realistic aspiration point actually leads to significantly better outcomes. People who aim high just simply get more. Which naturally leads us to the ZOPA, or the zone of possible agreement. Think of this as the overlap. If your bottom line is you won't take less than $75,000 and the employer's absolute maximum budget is $90,000, the ZOPA is literally anywhere between those two numbers. Any figure in that range is a successful deal just waiting to happen. But if their absolute maximum budget is $70,000 and your minimum is $75,000, well, there is no ZOPA. The numbers just don't overlap. And because you know your BATNA, you don't argue, you don't aggressively compromise, you just simply and confidently walk away. All right, Section 3, interests versus positions. This right here is the major psychological pivot of our explainer. If you genuinely want to stop fighting over a fixed pie and start expanding it, you have to shift your focus from what people demand on the surface to why they are actually demanding it. You see, negotiations usually hit a complete brick wall because people rigidly stick to their positions. A position is a concrete demand, like saying, I want $100,000. If the company says, look, we can only pay 80, boom, you have a deadlock. Think of a position like the visible tip of an iceberg. Real flexibility is found below the surface, in the interests. These are the underlying needs driving that demand. If the real reason they want $100,000 is because they have crushing student loan debt, well, that's an interest. Once you uncover that why by simply asking a few good questions, you can find alternative ways to satisfy the need, maybe through a great signing bonus or a student loan repayment assistance program. Take the totally classic negotiation story of two people fighting over a single orange. In traditional positional bargaining, they just argue until they finally compromise, cutting it right down the middle so each gets 50%. Honestly, a suboptimal outcome. But with interest-based bargaining, they stop and ask why. It actually turns out person A wants the juice to drink, and person B just wants the peel for baking a cake. By exploring those interests, person A gets 100% of the juice, and person B gets 100% of the peel. They completely expanded the pie because they stopped fighting over the position. Section 4, expanding the pie. A huge mistake people make is trying to claim value before they've actually created it. If you immediately sit down and start aggressively demanding a bigger slice of the pie, the other person instantly gets defensive. And then you fall into what's called the negotiators dilemma, where both sides just withhold information and ultimately lose out on some serious potential gains. So to avoid that exact dilemma, you have to do the work before you ever even sit down. Research proves time and time again that preparation is the single biggest predictor of negotiation success, period. It beats charisma and it beats experience every single time. You got to develop your backup plan, estimate their leverage, set your strict limits, try to anticipate their underlying interests, and thoroughly research the market. If you skip this preparation phase, a prepared negotiator is absolutely going to dominate you, simply because they did the homework and you didn't. Once you're fully prepared, you can use this super powerful value creation technique called log rolling. I know, it's kind of a funny word, but if you're only arguing over one issue, like a salary figure, someone literally has to lose for the other to win. But if you bring multiple issues into the deal, you can start trading based on different priorities. Maybe you trade a slightly lower starting salary in exchange for an extra week of paid vacation, or maybe the ability to work remotely twice a week. You really value the time, and the company really values saving cash up front. You both walk away way happier because you exploited your different valuations. And finally, Section 5. Anchors and concessions. We've talked all about preparing and creating value, but eventually you do actually have to claim value. It's time to discuss the hard table tactics of the give and take. The most critical psychological tactic at the table is the anchoring effect. The very first number mentioned in a negotiation acts exactly like a gravitational pull, setting the frame for the entire discussion. If an employer throws out a low anchor of $70,000, the whole conversation centers around that range. Surprisingly, recent studies suggest that you should almost always try to make the first offer. You want to make an aggressive, yet highly credible first offer because it psychologically pulls their counteroffers right into your preferred zone. It's wild how well it works. But look, you will eventually have to make some concessions, and concessions have a psychological language all their own. First, concede slowly. Giving up ground too fast just signals desperation. Next, make them contingent. If you give up something, explicitly ask for something in return to establish a sense of fairness. Third, it is absolutely vital to shrink the size of your concessions over time. Going from giving up $1,000 to $500 to $50, that signals to the other party that you are hitting your absolute limit. And finally, always hold a tiny concession back for the very end. It gives the other party a final psychological win that really smooths out the closing of the deal. So I really want to leave you with this question to ponder. These principles we covered, understanding your backup plan, digging into the why, and smartly anchoring your value, these aren't just business tricks, they are absolutely vital life skills. In your next everyday conflict, will you just stubbornly fight over a fixed pie, or will you do the work to expand it? Think about that for a second. And get ready, because in part 2 of this explainer, we're going to dive into the dark side of the table, exactly how to handle hardball tactics, difficult people, and the sneaky cognitive biases that totally sabotage our deals. Look, if you've ever felt like you left money on the table or got completely steamrolled by an aggressive counterpart, this is exactly where we fix that. We're taking the foundational research from places like Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton and translating it into a masterclass on execution. So, here's our roadmap for part 2. We'll be looking at gathering intel, breaking deadlocks, navigating the internal battlefield, handling complexity and culture, and finally, mastering the endgame. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, Gathering Intel, or the Information Game. At its core, negotiation is basically a game of incomplete information, right? Victory almost always goes to the party who can uncover the other side's true position. So how do you actually gather that intel? Well, you don't just guess, you methodically execute these steps. First, ask open-ended questions to dig up their why. Second, pay close attention to their nonverbal cues. A slight hesitation speaks volumes. Third, and this is literally a masterstroke, use silence. Just stop talking after making an offer. Human beings absolutely hate awkward silence, and it's crazy, but they will frequently negotiate against themselves just to fill the quiet. And lastly, make calculated offers to test their limits. Think of that calculated offer like a submarine sonar ping. Let's say you offer $70,000 and they accept immediately. Well, oops, you just learned you offered way too much. But if they counter at $75,000, that instant reaction reveals the hidden zone of possible agreement, or ZOBA. Their walkaway number is floating somewhere right between those 2 points. Moving on to Section 2, Navigating Friction, which means dealing with deadlocks and difficult people. Because no matter how much intel you've gathered, eventually you're going to hit a wall. A total deadlock, where nobody moves an inch, is the ultimate nightmare scenario for an unprepared negotiator. The tension spikes, and your amateur instinct kicks in. You either want to aggressively double down, or just completely cave to make the friction stop. But instead of panicking, master negotiators use this exact sequence to restart the momentum. First up, literally just take a break. Stepping away cools the emotions down and gives everyone some much-needed perspective. Next, shift the focus away from the positional standoff and go back to problem solving by revisiting those underlying interests. Third, brainstorm some new options without judging them right away. Just get the creative juices flowing. And hey, if you're still totally stuck, bring in a neutral third-party mediator to help smooth things out. Now, what if the deadlock is happening because the person across the table is just aggressive or negotiating in bad faith? You can use this checklist to disarm those hardball tactics. The golden rule here: stay calm and never ever match their emotion. Your composure is your superpower. Separate the person from the problem. If they attack you personally, try to reframe it. Say something like, okay, it sounds like you're really concerned about this specific issue, so let's talk about how we can address that. Believe it or not, you can even ask for their advice. Shifting them from an adversary to an advisor is a brilliant way to regain control of the room. And obviously, always set firm boundaries against actual abuse. All right, Section 3, the internal battlefield. Time to talk about emotions and biases. You know, we spend so much time prepping for the person across the table, we totally forget that our own brains can betray us. Interestingly, while flying off the handle destroys value, using emotion strategically is actually a massive tool. Research shows that visibly displaying disappointment can successfully pull concessions from the other side, while a controlled flash of anger signals that you're standing firm. You feel the emotion, sure, but you don't let it run the show. You intentionally use it to shape the outcome. Beyond our feelings, we also fall into these sneaky cognitive traps, like the fixed pie bias. This is that false assumption that every deal is a zero-sum game. Like, if I win, you absolutely have to lose. The solution here is to actively reject that bias. You want to pivot back to exploring underlying interests, brainstorm, and figure out how to expand the pie so both sides actually walk away with more value. Let's break down 3 other major biases you've got to watch out for. First is anchoring. That's when the very first number thrown out completely dominates the negotiation. The fix? Counter-anchor immediately and aggressively. Then there's the sunk cost fallacy, sticking with a bad deal just because you've already poured a ton of time into it. You have to override this by making decisions based purely on future value. Finally, the endowment effect. This makes you overvalue things simply because you already own them. So, anticipate these mental glitches and apply these reframing solutions to keep your judgment crystal clear. Section 4, Complexity and Culture, or how things change when we scale up. As we move up from two-party negotiations to complex, multi-party or cross-border deals, simply adding more people completely changes the geometry of the agreement. You can't just wing it. You need to actively map out every single stakeholder and their specific walkaway alternatives, or BATNS. You've got to find where interests align, build coalitions strategically to get some leverage, and remember, managing the actual process of who speaks and how decisions are made is just as crucial as the substance of the deal itself. And we can't ignore how cultural dimensions fundamentally alter your entire strategy. Look at this comparison. What's considered polite and direct in a low-context culture like the US, where literally everything is spelled out, can be deeply offensive in a high-context culture like Japan, where saving face is everything. The takeaway here: never assume your communication norms are universal. Do your research and adapt to the culture you're dealing with. Which brings us to Section 5, the endgame. Closing, walking away, and ethics. This is all about the mechanics of securely closing the deal. Honestly, it's tragic how many brilliant negotiations just fall apart right at the finish line. To get across that threshold safely and not lose momentum, you need to execute these 5 steps. First, summarize the terms so there is zero ambiguity. Second, explicitly address any remaining obstacles. Third, create a sense of legitimate urgency to close the deal today. Fourth, throw in one final, tiny concession just to build some lasting goodwill. And number 5, absolutely crucial, get the whole shebang in writing immediately. But you really need to remember this truth. Sometimes the best outcome is no outcome at all. If your bottom lines just don't overlap, or if the cost to the relationship is just way too high, walking away is your ultimate power move. It shows you have strong alternatives, and honestly, it protects you from a lot of long-term regret. Now, what's super interesting here is navigating the ethical gray areas. There's a really vital distinction between acceptable strategic advocacy and outright unethical deception. Exaggerating your alternatives or maybe bluffing about your absolute bottom line, those are widely accepted tactics in the gray area of negotiation. But outright lying about material facts or faking information, that crosses a hard line. Your integrity is your foundation, so never burn your reputation for a quick win. To wrap up this explainer, the big takeaway from all this advanced strategy is that true negotiation mastery is not combat. The absolute best negotiators aren't the loudest or the most aggressive people in the room. They're simply the most prepared. It's really an exercise in empathy, understanding human psychology, and finding creative solutions that expand the value for everyone involved. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Negotiation is a life skill. It dictates your salary, the quality of your relationships, and really the entire trajectory of your success. You're negotiating every single day, whether you realize it or not. So looking at your own life right now, which of these advanced tactics are you going to deploy in your next high-stakes conversation? And honestly, what are you leaving on the table if you don't?